Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Dorset Business Angels, for inviting me to come and say a few words. A daunting task, if I'm honest with you, sort of to be invited in such a sort of seasoned investors, and many of you in the audience. And the truth of the matter is, I was asked to sort of talk about lessons imparted, lessons learnt. And frankly speaking, I decided to properly think it through and think, actually, what lessons have I actually learned? You know, over the years, I have probably signed off somewhere in the circa £100 million worth of monies spent and invested in different businesses of different sizes, from small to medium to large. And the honest truth is, when I think about the lessons learned, those lessons predominantly are how to avoid getting it wrong. Because over the past sort of 10 years, I've comfortably seen 10 million quid's worth of cash vaporize when it comes to investments in enterprises. So it sounds like it's coming from a negative perspective, talking about sort of what can go wrong. But actually, when I think about the lessons learned, how can we get it right? How can we minimize the downside? So basically, that's what my presentation today is about. And by the way, please don't believe everything you see. When you look at the photograph, it was in fact in the middle of a field. There was no sunshine. There is a tractor there if you can't spot it closely, and a bottle of wine to my right-hand side. So this is a bit interactive. I shall ask some questions. Does anybody know who Ben Graham is? Anybody know who Warren Buffett is? Yes. Right on. So Ben Graham hired Warren Buffett. Ben Graham is the father of American investing. So I put the actual slide up to say, basically, the individual investor should act consistently as an investor. There's a difference between investing and speculating. And equally, there is a difference between gambling, speculating, and investing. And I think if we're talking about professional investing, is we've got to understand what the difference actually looks like. So I think the first question is, what are we trying to aim at? And if you look at this particular business here, this is Improbable. I don't know if anybody has actually heard of it. I know, Peter, you've spoken about this. So these are Cambridge/Imperial College graduates. And, they made headlines after it was announced at the closure of a 500 million Series B investment round, which valued the business at $1 billion. So clearly what we're saying here is it is possible to find investments where as seed investors, you can make a lot of money. So if you'd have invested, forgive the denominations, but if you'd have invested $10,000 for 1% of this business, then for certain, right now, you wouldn't be sat here with me. So you'd be bobbing up and down in the ocean somewhere enjoying a gin and tonic. So there are some big companies out there that have some great success stories. And I pulled this up, actually. I heard, Jenny, you mention about China. I think somebody mentioned about China. Here's 15 companies that you probably have never heard of. And all of these companies have emerged in the year 2017 alone. And they're all unicorns. They're all startups. And they're all valued at more than $1 billion. Funnily enough, if you talk about sort of where these companies are popping up, in particular China, we're seeing more and more of these companies coming up with radical AI-driven technologies. But basically my message is this: it is possible to find fabulous investments, but of course, there is a slight problem. And the problem is that if you look at the volume of companies that are looking for investment, there are thousands, tens of thousands of companies. I went on one crowd sourcing, forgive me, website, and this one alone had 20,000 companies looking for investments. So as investors, the question is, how do you find the needle in the haystack? Because quite frankly, the volume, and when Peter talks about the number of companies that he's investing, it's the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many companies that you can invest in. When you look at the companies, and some of these are just noted on the bottom here, for the inexperienced eye, they all look good. They all look like great investment potentials. So how do we find the right ones? And of course, the second question is, even if you find the right investment or the right kind of company to go and spend money in, what is the percentage chance that it's actually going to turn out to be a good return? And I was really struggling to find in the UK actually any statistics that can give us any degree of insight. But I found this from America, and this is most common angel exits. It actually comes from a private equity fund over there. And what you can see is 50%, a minimum 50% of the investments, this is angel investments, go bust. So there's at least a 50% chance that if you invest your business money as an angel, is that money is going to vaporize and disappear. So as Peter said, as one or two other said, it's not a game for the faint-hearted. You know, there are some of these that, for example, have got money out of it. Initial public offering will have come out of it. 0.1% will make money. And there will be some others. But for sure, this lines up with my personal experience that at least half of the investments that have angel investments don't make it. Now, I quite like the phrase The Walking Dead, because that's actually a lot of those I've come across those where basically the businesses are limping and they are not going any further forward. I was going to put a picture of Donald Trump on this particular slide, and I thought, you know, it's going to detract me and I'm going to go off on a different tangent. You know, we live in a celebrity-driven culture where, you know, we think or we believe that, you know, certain individuals have the Midas touch. You know, Lord Sugar, you know, we see the Dragon's Dens. We see individuals that have, you know, quite frankly, we think they have the sixth sense when it comes to spotting opportunities, and basically they alone are able to convert it and turn it into a wonderful opportunity. The question is it really true? When you scrape away the surface and you work with some of the individuals and people that have been investing for decades, and you say, and you actually get hold of the numbers and start to examine the actual success over a long run, is it that they have a Midas touch, or is it actually something else? And in my experience, it's something else. So this particular slide is, you know, the 20 years worth of distilled experience. And, you know, my view is the most experienced investors, number one, is they get a group of trusted individuals. They build a network of associates and individuals who will not only help them screen investments, but will also act as a sounding board and sometimes the naysayer. Individuals that will really help build the intellectual picture of whether investments are a good investment or not. And if you look at any of the people that you think have the Midas touch, like Lord Alan Sugar, like Richard Branson, like any of the Dragon's Dens, or a plethora of private equity individuals that, you know, I've met along the journey, behind the scenes, they will have their Karen Brady, they will have their Claude Littner, they will have their individuals that they will use as a sounding board and will actively encourage them to screen their investments. I think this is an activity we can do. As investors, we can create networks and we can get together with individuals, people in the room who have great business experience and saying, please help me. Please help me screen these opportunities. The second one is the use of data. You know, this idea that we have a sixth sense and, you know, we can sit there as Dragon's Den and actually see people present to us and automatically say, it's that one. That one's the one that's going to win. My view is it's always driven by data. So when the television program stops and people go, you know, offline, is get hold of the data and use copious amounts of data. And the kind of data I'm talking about is not the data where you're going to model out to see how much money you're going to make. It's about understanding the markets, the business, the competitors, the actors within those businesses, looking to see if any have been invested in and actually been successful. There's a copious amount of data you can extract using the internet. You don't actually need an awful lot more than the internet. But my experience is professional investors that go the course of distance, 30, 40 years, and have a batting average of more than 50%, are using an awful lot of data. And the last thing really is the radical truth, and forgive me, I've picked this up from somebody else, and that is the radical truth, because as investors, I've sat with investors, I've invested some money of my own, and I've been sat in the boardroom investing in big companies, small companies, and sometimes there's a small voice that sits there in the corner that says, this is not a great idea, or actually it could be improved because. And, you know, if you say where do things go wrong, it's typically because there is an alpha person, I avoid the word male, but I think the statistics stack up what I've seen today. There's an alpha male sat in the corner going, shut up, I know best, this is a great idea. And I haven't come here to talk about some of the case examples of where I've seen money wasted, but it is 10 million hard cash over the past 10 years. In several different examples. Because of this, because the individual had the final vote, said, listen, I don't want to hear the truth or what I think is the truth, I'm going to tell you what my truth is. So, you know, the people that succeed, I think, want to hear the radical truth. And, you know, for those of you that enjoy reading about investment, I've lifted it from this chap here. Does anybody know Ray Dalio? I'll take that as maybe a no, okay. Ray is the CEO of a company called Bridgewater Associates in America. He has $160 million of hedge fund that he invests. He's out doing promotion about a book that he's written. But what's interesting about this guy here is that he was a very successful Wall Street trader. And he built up Bridgewater Associates to have, it was over $150 million US. He invests in stocks and bonds and so on. And he went nearly bust twice. So at one time he was nearly employing 1,000 people, and it went from 1,000 down to 1 back to him. And he did that twice in 15 years. And what happened is it encouraged him to say, hang on a second, you know, what went wrong? And he was very public failures, because he was a pundit that goes on the American news quite a lot and is invited to explain about what's happening in the world of finance, and twice bet the wrong way. As the slide says, he said, listen, how do I move from a mindset that says I'm right about something and saying, how do I know I'm right? And he put in place a series of principles within his business that has seen the business, you know, do extremely well. It's the world's #1 or 2 biggest hedge fund. I know I'm bringing up an example of some big business, and this guy's investing in, you know, things like stocks and shares and bonds. But it's a thought process, which is pretty much what I'm talking about today. This is what he had to say about it. He said, we're all flawed, basically. You know, some of us are risk averse, some of us take on too much risk. You know, some of us are very micromanagement, like the details, some of us like the very big picture. But basically, I'm afraid we're all one way too much, all of us. And his, again, lifting it from him, what he encourages, and it lines up with my experience, is the power of thoughtful disagreement. Which comes back to the slide that I mentioned of having a group of individuals that you can consult with, talk with. That's where the power of thoughtful disagreement should come about. Because 20,000 investment opportunities on one website, countless opportunities to meet companies and screen them. How do you work your way through to come up with a good investment? Because one of the lessons I'm going to take from this particular day today is, you know, you can put your money into business, and that's my experience, and 10 years can go by and you may or may not get that money back. What you want to do is not be part of the 50% that don't get the money back. So my personal view is the singular method of approaching an investment in this way, protecting the downside, is by far the best approach to potentially avoiding a disaster. So forgive me, it's a methodology. I can't tell you which investments to invest in, but it's a way of approaching investments. Or as a carpenter friend of mine once said, measure twice, cut once. Okay, and then there is, of course, there's probably some sophisticated, well, I know there's some sophisticated investors in the room, and then there's some probably people that are just starting out on the journey. You know, listen, there are some technical things to get on top of. And, you know, we talked a little bit about earlier, I heard mentioned about having a board seat, sitting with the company. I think it's personally very important to be part of the organisation, not operationally, but to understand and sit with the company you invest in for its lifetime. You know, and understand the difference between economics and control. You know, as investors, what you're focused on, or what we're focused on, is economics. We want to get some money back, you know, a 5 times return, 2 times, or whatever it is. What we often forget is the concept of control. Somebody once said to me 20 years ago, he said, Justin, he says, I can buy a 10% stake in a business and control that business. And honestly, I was scratching my head for days afterwards thinking, how does he do that? You know, I've read shareholder agreements, and, you know, that majority share, they seem to be able to run that business. As minority stakeholders, you can choose to have veto or voting rights over key important things that happen in that business. So you can have a level of control in the business. I think it's quite important sometimes. You know, and I know that we talked about EIS and SEIS, I shan't labour too much about that, but occasionally, there is occasional where it's good to put in convertible debt and to understand what that means, which is loaning a company money and turning it into shares, you know, downstream. It avoids valuing a business. Sometimes, you know, people, when they're, you know, coming to you for investments, you know, they'll often get hung up on valuation. They'll say, listen, my startup in my bedroom is worth 5 million quid, honest. You know, and it's difficult sometimes to get people off. But if it's a good investment, sometimes a convertible debt is a great way to actually get in. You know, also anti-dilution provisions. You know, for those of you not familiar with them, you know, if you invest at £1 a share and you then go to a Series A investment round and that gets invested at a lesser value, it dilutes you down. You can find ways to avoid it. So to get on top of what that kind of means. A couple of technical things, liquidation preferences. I've got to say, there are ways you can structure it to potentially get your money out. There is very, very few companies, or very few investors that ever get the money out, as it so happens. But there are mechanisms by which you can invest, where you can say, listen, I want my money back before there is a liquidation event. In other words, the business gets sold or the next round of funding. And of course, you know, spreading the risk over several investments. I've heard the magic number's 25. Apparently 25 is the statistical number by which you're going to have more than a 50% batting average if getting it right. Frankly speaking, I know very, very few people that have 25 investments. You know, generally the thought process in terms of how to approach investments by the mechanism I discussed at least will help protect the downside a little bit. So listen, thank you very much for your time and listening to me. Thank you.